In June 2008, a message appeared on an internet forum. Just a few simple words typed into the digital void. The time has come. Moments later, 7 people would be dead in one of Tokyo's busiest districts, killed by a man named Tomohiro Kato in what would become known as the AKIHABARA massacre, one of the most shocking acts of violence in modern Japanese history. This is not simply a story about a crime. It's a story about what happens when pressure becomes unbearable, when isolation calcifies into rage, when a human being breaks under the weight of expectations they can never meet. If you're drawn to understanding the mysteries of human behavior, the dark corners where ordinary lives transform into tragedy across Asia, then subscribe to this channel. There are countless stories waiting to be told, each one revealing something profound about the societies we live in and the breaking points we all possess. Today, we're going to examine not just what Tomohiro Kato did on that terrible day in June, but who he was before. The child, the teenager, the young man who was methodically crushed by the very people who should have protected him. Because understanding how someone becomes capable of such violence requires us to look back at the beginning, at the small cruelties that accumulate over years, at the moments when help should have come but didn't, at the point where a human soul stops seeking connection and starts planning destruction. Tomohiro Kato was born on September 28, 1982, in Aomori, a city in the northern reaches of Japan. On paper, his family had everything. His father worked as a manager at a financial institution, earning a substantial salary that comfortably supported the household. His mother didn't work outside the home, focusing instead on domestic duties, and most intensely on the education and development of her 2 sons, Tomohiro and his younger brother. They weren't struggling. They had resources, stability, the outward appearance of middle-class success. But inside that home, behind the respectable facade, something toxic was growing. It should come as no surprise to anyone familiar with Japanese society that there exists enormous pressure on children to excel academically. Success in school is seen as the pathway to a good university, which leads to a prestigious job, which determines your entire life trajectory. This cultural emphasis on achievement isn't unique to Japan, but the intensity of it, the way it permeates every aspect of family life, creates a pressure cooker environment that not every child can withstand. In the Kato household, this pressure wasn't just cultural, it was personal, brutal, and unrelenting. In the beginning, young Tomohiro seemed capable of meeting his parents' expectations. During elementary school, he was thriving by most measurable standards. His grades were excellent, placing him at the top of his class. He was also athletic, excelling particularly in track and field. He even became president of his school's tennis club, suggesting leadership qualities and social competence. By all accounts, he was popular, surrounded by friends, a boy other children liked and respected. His parents had every reason to be proud. He was becoming exactly what they wanted him to be. But then came middle school, and everything began to unravel. After his years of glory as a bright, popular elementary student, Tomohiro was accepted into one of the most prestigious schools in the region, exactly the kind of achievement his parents had pushed him toward. He moved to this new school for his middle and high school years, and what should have been a triumph, a validation of all that hard work, instead became the beginning of his destruction. Adolescence is difficult for most people even under the best circumstances. Hormones surge, social dynamics become more complex, academic demands intensify. But for Tomohiro, the difficulty was compounded by something far more damaging than typical teenage struggles. When we talk about his parents being strict, we're not discussing parents who insisted on good grades or limited screen time. We're talking about abuse. Systematic, methodical, relentless abuse. Multiple sources who investigated Tomohiro's background after the massacre described the relationship between him and his parents, particularly his mother, as profoundly abusive. When Tomohiro made a spelling or grammar mistake on his homework, his mother wouldn't simply correct the error. She would tear up the entire page and force him to start over from the beginning. His parents would quiz him on mathematical equations, testing his knowledge, and if he gave a wrong answer, they would hold his head under freezing water in the bathtub. Neighbors reported seeing young Tomohiro standing outside the house in the dead of winter, locked out as punishment for failing to meet his parents' academic standards. The winters in northern Japan are brutal, with temperatures regularly dropping below freezing. Leaving a child outside in such conditions isn't discipline. It's cruelty bordering on attempted murder. Tomohiro's younger brother, who gave interviews to the media after the massacre, described their childhood in horrifying terms. He recalled one incident where Tomohiro was forced to eat food off the floor after receiving poor grades on a test. The abuse was constant, creative in its cruelty, designed not to motivate but to humiliate and control. And predictably, these violent methods didn't result in better academic performance. They had precisely the opposite effect. The prestigious school Tomohiro attended published rankings of all students, displaying academic performance for everyone to see. Whether this practice is unusual is debatable. Many high-achieving schools in East Asia employ similar systems, believing public competition motivates excellence. But for Tomohiro, already struggling under the weight of abuse at home and the transition to a more demanding academic environment, these rankings became a source of shame. Out of 360 students, he ranked around 300 academically. He had fallen from the top of his elementary school class to near the bottom of his new school, and everyone knew it. His social life collapsed as well. The popular, friendly boy from elementary school had transformed into someone his classmates described as solitary and strange. Many of them bullied him or simply excluded him from social interactions. There were rumors that he walked around school carrying a knife, though whether this was true or simply the kind of exaggeration that attaches itself to isolated students is unclear. What is clear is that Tomohiro was profoundly alone, failing academically, abused at home, and rejected by his peers. He was trapped in a nightmare with no visible exit. Things reached a critical point when Tomohiro began preparing for university entrance examinations. In Japan, these exams are monumental events that determine which university you can attend, which in turn largely determines your career prospects and life trajectory. The pressure on students is immense. For Tomohiro, it was unbearable, made worse by the fact that his mother had decided years earlier that he would become an engineer, specifically at Hokkaido University. He'd never had a choice in the matter. His path had been predetermined before he was old enough to have opinions about his own future. But his grades weren't good enough for Hokkaido University. Despite the abuse meant to motivate him, despite the freezing punishments and forced hours of study, he wasn't performing at the level required for admission to a top-tier engineering program. The failure wasn't just academic, it was existential. It meant he had disappointed his parents, that the abuse had all been for nothing, that his entire childhood of suffering had failed to produce the result it was meant to achieve. So he lied. When it came time to report his university entrance exam results, Tomohiro told his parents he had been accepted to Hokkaido University, and they believed him, at least for a while. He enrolled not at Hokkaido, but at a technical college, studying automobile mechanics, a respectable field, but not the prestigious engineering program his mother had envisioned. For a period, he managed to maintain the deception, telling his parents what they wanted to hear while living a completely different reality. But lies of this magnitude can't be sustained forever. Eventually, the truth emerged. We don't know exactly how his parents discovered the deception, but when they did, the consequences were devastating. Tomohiro was essentially disowned, cut off emotionally if not financially, treated as a failure who had betrayed the family's investment in him. Despite this, Tomohiro managed to graduate from the technical college in 2005. He had acquired practical skills, a diploma, the credentials necessary to find work in his field. But perhaps the damage to his psychology was already too deep. He found employment at various companies, but never stayed long, cycling through jobs without establishing stability or building a career. At one point, he worked at a car parts factory, but his employment was temporary, precarious, offering no security or sense of future. His personal life was equally bleak. He was in his mid-20s by this point, an age when many people are building relationships, establishing independence, finding their place in the world. But Tomohiro had none of that. He described himself as having no friends, no girlfriend, no social connections of any meaningful kind. He spent his time online, participating in forums, seeking the human connection in digital spaces that he couldn't find in physical ones. In 2008, he began frequenting a mobile phone forum, a community where people discussed various topics, shared thoughts, sought acknowledgement from strangers. For Tomohiro, this forum became his primary social outlet, perhaps his only one. But even in this anonymous digital space, he encountered rejection. He posted frequently, perhaps too frequently, in ways that other forum members found annoying or strange. Eventually, someone began impersonating him, posting messages under his username, saying things designed to make him look foolish or offensive. This identity theft, this violation of the one space where he thought he had some control, some voice, seems to have pushed him past a psychological threshold. His posts in the forum became darker, more explicit in their expression of rage and desperation. He wrote about wanting to be noticed, about being tired of being ignored, about how he had nothing to lose because he had nothing at all. Then came June 2008, and the final trigger. Tomohiro was working at a factory on a temporary contract. One of those positions that offers no job security, no benefits, no guarantee of continued employment. Workers in such positions exist in a state of constant anxiety, knowing they could be dismissed at any moment. The factory where Tomohiro worked had announced plans to lay off 150 temporary workers, retaining only 50. He believed he was among those who would be dismissed. This belief was based partly on the disappearance of his work uniform. He'd looked for it in its usual place and couldn't find it, interpreting this as a deliberate signal from management that he was being fired, that he should stop coming to work. In his mind, this missing uniform represented the final rejection, the last confirmation that he was worthless, unwanted, expendable. On June 8, 2008, Tomohiro made his preparations with methodical care. He rented a truck, purchasing time with the vehicle as casually as someone might rent a car for a weekend trip. He bought a knife, a weapon chosen for its accessibility and lethality in close quarters. And he began posting messages to his mobile forum, a digital diary of his final hours, a countdown to violence that he broadcast to the only community he'd ever felt partially connected to, even if they'd rejected him there too. His posts that morning were explicit about his intentions. He wrote, "I don't have a single friend and I won't in the future. I'll be ignored because I'm ugly. I'm lower than trash because at least trash gets recycled." The pain in these words is palpable. A young man convinced of his own worthlessness, unable to see any future where things improve, where connection becomes possible, where life holds any value. He continued, "I'm sick of the world. It's the world's fault. I'll kill people." It wasn't a cry for help at this point. It was a declaration, a promise, a preview of horror to come. And then, at 10:30 in the morning, he posted, "The time has come. AKIHABARA is one of Tokyo's most famous districts, known internationally as a hub for electronics, anime, manga, and gaming culture. On Sundays, Chuodori, the main street running through AKIHABARA, was traditionally closed to vehicle traffic, transforming into a pedestrian paradise where thousands of people would stroll, shop, and gather. It was a place of joy, of fandom, of people pursuing their interests and passions. It was also, for Tomohiro's purposes, a target-rich environment. At 12:30 in the afternoon on June 8, 2008, Tomohiro drove his rented truck at high speed down Chuodori, deliberately plowing into pedestrians. The truck struck multiple people, bodies flying. The peaceful Sunday afternoon transformed in seconds into a scene of carnage and chaos. He then exited the vehicle, knife in hand, and began attacking anyone within reach. He was indiscriminate in his violence, stabbing people without regard for who they were. Men, women, young, old, it didn't matter. He simply wanted to hurt as many people as possible, to make his pain external, to force the world that had ignored him to pay attention. The police arrived within minutes. The area had numerous police boxes and a constant security presence given its popularity, with tourists and the frequent large crowds. Locating Tomohiro wasn't difficult. Witnesses pointed him out, and he was still attacking people, still screaming, still wielding the knife. One police officer struck him in the head with a metal baton, but Tomohiro kept moving, kept attacking. Finally, multiple officers cornered him, drawing their firearms and pointing them at him. An extremely unusual sight in Japan, where police rarely display weapons in this manner. There's even video footage of the arrest, filmed by a bystander, showing Tomohiro simply giving up, dropping the knife, surrendering. There was no possibility of denial. Everyone had seen what he'd done. A witness who spoke to the LA Times described the scene as one of utter chaos and horror. She mentioned being disturbed not only by the attack itself, but by the behavior of bystanders, many of whom pulled out their phones to photograph and film the victims lying on the ground rather than offering assistance. This impulse to document rather than help, to prove one's presence at a tragedy rather than attempting to mitigate it, is a disturbing feature of our smartphone age. At least 17 ambulances responded to the scene, transporting the wounded to hospitals across Tokyo. In total, 7 people lost their lives that day, and 10 others were injured, some critically. That evening, Akihabara's sidewalks filled with flowers, green tea, offerings placed in mourning for those who had died. The district that represented joy and fandom and community had become a site of grief, a place where people came not to shop, but to remember the dead. When Tomohiro was taken to the police station, he was cooperative. There was no point in resistance. He'd been arrested in the act, captured on numerous cameras and witnessed by hundreds of people. He confessed to the crimes immediately, but initially he showed no remorse for what he'd done. When police questioned him about his motivations, he offered 3 primary explanations. First, he believed he had lost his temporary factory job, the only thing he had in his life, and this loss had been the final trigger. Second, he was extremely lonely, with no friends and no girlfriend, isolated in a way that had become unbearable. Third, he was being bullied, not just in his school years, but online in the forum where he'd sought connection, where someone had impersonated him and turned even that small community against him. What surprised many observers was what Tomohiro didn't mention: his parents. He acknowledged they had been strict, but at no point did he blame the massacre on his upbringing, on the years of abuse, on the impossible expectations and brutal punishments. Perhaps by this point in his life, he had internalized the abuse so completely that it seemed normal to him. Perhaps he still, on some level, believed that the fault was his. That if he had simply been smarter, better, stronger, he could have met their expectations, and none of this would have happened. Or perhaps he was protecting them, even then, unable to fully acknowledge the damage they had done. On March 24, 2011, Tomohiro Kato was sentenced to death. He remains in prison, awaiting execution, his place in the queue determined by the slow machinery of Japan's capital punishment system. It was only after the death sentence was handed down that Tomohiro finally expressed something resembling remorse. He issued a statement apologizing to those who had died, to the injured, and to their families. But he also claimed to have little memory of the attack itself, as though he'd been in some kind of dissociative state, operating on autopilot, disconnected from the reality of what his body was doing. The victims of Tomohiro's violence weren't the only ones who suffered in the aftermath. His own family was devastated. His father was forced to resign from his job at the financial institution, unable to continue working as his colleagues harassed him, treating him as complicit in his son's crimes. His parents divorced shortly after the massacre. His mother was admitted to a psychiatric ward, unable to cope with the knowledge of what her son had done, and perhaps, one hopes, forced to confront her own role in creating the conditions that led to it. His father, now unemployed and alone, still lives in the family home where Tomohiro grew up, reportedly closed off from the world, speaking to no one, existing in a kind of self-imposed exile. Tomohiro's younger brother, who had always been present in his life, who had witnessed the same abuse even if he'd experienced it differently, also had to resign from his job due to harassment. He spoke publicly about how his brother had destroyed his life, how the burden of being the killer's sibling had made normal existence impossible. He became severely depressed, another casualty of violence that rippled outward, touching everyone connected to the perpetrator. The family issued public apologies to the victims and their families, acknowledging their son's crimes, but apologies cannot undo death or restore what was lost. They will never have normal lives again. The attack sent shockwaves through Japan, a country that prides itself on its relatively low crime rate and sense of public safety. Yes, crimes occur everywhere, and Japan is not immune to violence, but mass attacks like this were shocking precisely because they violated expectations about what kind of society Japan was supposed to be. The government responded by reviewing laws regarding knife sales, implementing stricter regulations about who could purchase large blades and under what circumstances. The Sunday pedestrian closures on Chodori and AKIHABARA were discontinued for several years, the streets now open to traffic as a security measure, though this policy has since been partially reversed. The gaming company Konami canceled 3 launch events for their upcoming game, Metal Gear Solid 4, Guns of the Patriots, deeming it inappropriate to celebrate a game featuring weapons so soon after a mass stabbing, and here's something that makes the entire tragedy even more haunting. After the massacre, the factory where Tomohiro had worked came forward with a statement. They had never intended to fire him. When they announced plans to lay off 150 temporary workers and retain 50, Tomohiro was going to be among the 50 who kept their jobs. He had misinterpreted the situation. His missing uniform wasn't a signal of termination. It had simply been misplaced or stolen by someone else, an unfortunate coincidence that he had read as a deliberate message. The one thing he believed had triggered his final break from reality, the loss of his job, hadn't even been real. It was a misunderstanding, a mistake, a false belief that led to real deaths. This revelation forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. If Tomohiro's uniform had been in its proper place that day, if he hadn't believed he was being fired, would the massacre have happened at all? Or was the violence inevitable, the result of decades of accumulated damage, and the missing uniform was simply the excuse his psyche needed to justify what he'd already decided to do? Would there have been a different trigger next week, next month? Some other perceived slight or loss that would have pushed him to the same endpoint? There are no simple answers to these questions. Human behavior is complex, determined by countless factors interacting in ways we can barely comprehend. Tomohiro Kato was shaped by his abusive childhood, by his isolation, by his failures both real and perceived, by a culture that placed enormous pressure on achievement while offering little support for those who struggled. He was also a human being with agency, with choices, who decided that his pain justified inflicting pain on innocent strangers who had done nothing to him. Both things can be true simultaneously. We can acknowledge the factors that damaged him while still holding him responsible for what he did. The AKIHABARA massacre stands as a reminder that violence rarely emerges from nowhere. It accumulates over time, building in the hidden spaces of a person's psychology, fed by abuse, neglect, rejection, and despair. The warning signs were there. A child being abused by his parents, a teenager isolated and bullied, a young man posting increasingly dark messages online about his hatred of the world and desire for revenge. But warning signs only matter if someone is watching, if someone intervenes, if society creates structures that catch falling people before they shatter completely. Tomohiro Kato sits in prison, waiting for the day when he will be executed, when the state will end his life as punishment for the lives he took. His victims remain dead, their families forever marked by loss. His own family is destroyed, scattered, broken by association with his crimes. And somewhere in all this wreckage, there are lessons about how we treat children, about the long-term consequences of abuse, about the importance of human connection, about recognizing when someone is crying out for help, even if they're doing so in ways that seem strange or threatening. These lessons matter. They matter because somewhere right now, there's another child being abused, another teenager being bullied, another young adult dissolving into isolation and rage. And if we pay attention, if we intervene, if we create a society that catches people before they fall, maybe, just maybe, we can prevent the next massacre before it begins. If this story has left you contemplating the hidden tragedies that unfold across Asia, the ways that personal pain can explode into public horror, consider subscribing to this channel. There are so many more stories waiting to be explored, each one revealing something essential about the societies we've built and the people who fall through their cracks. The mysteries we examine here aren't puzzles to be solved, but windows into human nature. Reminders that behind every act of violence lies a history, a context, a series of moments when different choices could have led to different outcomes. Understanding these stories won't bring back the dead, but it might help us recognize the warning signs in time to save the living.